Thanks so much, Ben, and thanks everyone for being here. Really excited to have Colton and Natasha. But first I'll introduce myself, Alana Roberts, Regional Affairs Director for PPL Electric Utilities, also the chairperson for Wyoming Valley Government Affairs, and working on a regional partnership with 5 other chambers, so 6 total. And some of our friends from the other chambers are here, so I just want to thank them. Pittston, Greater Scranton, Wyoming County, Back Mountain, Hazelton, Wyoming Valley. So we are hearing that people want to learn more about electric vehicles. And as part of this regional partnership, we want to be able to bring those educational opportunities to our membership, provide value. So we were able, I saw Colton speak in April. I thought it was really interesting, partially because I'm in the electric industry, but I think for everyone, there's a curiosity and an interest in this. So I'm glad you were able to come out to hear from them. Also, the committee has a big event coming in October. We're calling it LEAD, which is Legislative Education and Advocacy Day. So stay tuned for more information about that as well. It's going to be a new, interesting revamp of our legislative breakfast, and we're going to hear from a lot of different local people about what's going on in Northeast PA. So let me introduce our speakers. I'm happy to have Colton Brown, who's an energy program specialist for PA DEP, and his primary responsibility is managing EV charging station funding programs, engaging and educating stakeholders about EVs, and leading other electric vehicle initiatives. And Natasha Fackler has taken on a newly created role with PennDOT. She's the Infrastructure Implementation Coordinator. She's advising the governor's office and PennDOT developing best practices for the bipartisan infrastructure law program funds. She's also designated as the state's lead point of contact on the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure NEVI formula program, which we're going to hear a lot about, which is guiding investments in electrification across the Commonwealth. And prior to taking on this role, she served as policy director for 24 years in the Commonwealth. So both Natasha and Colton have a lot to share with us. Again, we'll do questions at the end. I know there'll be some, but for now, I'd like to turn it over to them to hear what they're working on.
All right, thank you, everyone. This is Colton. And as was mentioned, I definitely recommend taking advantage of that chat function. We're going to cover a lot of content. I'll move topics pretty quickly. So it's easy to have a question and lose track of it till the end. So it's a good way to mark it down. So we'll get to it later. So we're going to cover a variety of things here this morning. First, just an introduction to electric vehicles and charging, really just building a knowledge foundation so that we're all understanding the same terms and on the same page. I will cover some of the initiatives and the funding programs that we offer at Pennsylvania DEP. PennDOT will go over their electric vehicle initiatives, which will include their plans for National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Funds, which will come through the bipartisan infrastructure law. We'll have time for question and answer, and there's some resources at the end. And then we're also going to cover some additional federal funding opportunities that are existing or maybe coming up in the near future. Next slide. So first, just why are we talking about electric vehicles, and why does it seem like a lot of people are talking about electric vehicles? So there's certainly a lot of benefits to widespread use of electric vehicles. And this slide summarizes a lot of them. So we know that electric vehicles emit a lot less greenhouse gas emissions than their comparable internal combustion engine vehicles. This is even after we account for manufacturing and the electricity that they use to propel the vehicle. So charging from a standard, normal grid here in Pennsylvania, an electric vehicle emits about 1/3 of the life cycle greenhouse emissions as its comparable gasoline vehicle. It also emits significantly less other types of air pollution, your criteria air pollutants that affect the local health and communities around where those vehicles are operated. Additionally, since electric vehicles are charged via the grid and the grid continues to decrease in its emission intensity, that means that over the life of that electric vehicle, it will actually emit less and less, whereas a gasoline vehicle will emit the same amount every mile its entire lifespan. So as we see more electric vehicles on the roads, we will see improved health outcomes for the communities around those electric vehicles where they're operating, because it decreases that air pollution. Electric vehicles also have a number of economic benefits. So there's obviously the individual operating the electric vehicle has significant savings on fuel and maintenance. An electric vehicle generally costs about 50 to 70% less to fuel and about 30 to 40% less to maintain. Additionally, electricity stays in our local economy. It goes to an electric utility. It goes to generation of electricity domestically. It doesn't go to foreign countries like much of our oil purchases can. Electric vehicle adoption also has the potential to help create good local jobs in clean energy, both through the production of the vehicles, installing and maintaining the charging infrastructure, and the related supply chain. Next slide. So knowing that there's a lot of benefits to electric vehicles, we also need to define what we actually mean when we say electric vehicle. So on the left here, we're all pretty familiar with our, conventional gasoline vehicles, internal combustion engine, fueled entirely on gasoline or diesel. And many of us over the last couple of decades have started to become familiar with hybrid electric vehicles, which add a small electric battery and a small electric motor. Essentially enables you to, one of the biggest benefits is it enables brake regeneration. That small battery is able to essentially recapture all of the energy that would have been lost to friction via normal brake system whenever you're slowing down. So that way it recaptures that energy into that small battery, and that battery helps move the vehicle forward the next time that you're accelerating or traveling at a higher speed, which can dramatically improve the fuel efficiency of these vehicles. For the purposes of our discussion here today, we are not including regular hybrid vehicles when we say electric vehicle, because they still only receive an external power source of gasoline. So what we are referring to when we say electric vehicle is our plug-in hybrids and our battery electric vehicles. A plug-in hybrid is just like that hybrid I described, except it has a larger battery pack and is therefore able to charge via an external electricity source to travel in some electric only miles before the battery would be depleted, and then it would function just like a regular hybrid would. And then on the right, our battery electric vehicle is where we see the full benefits of electric vehicle. We no longer have an internal combustion engine. There's no gasoline going into the vehicle. It's just being powered by that electricity and the battery. Next slide. So once we have an understanding of these vehicles, most of the initial questions people will have revolve around charging. We've all grown up, seeing gasoline stations and becoming familiarized with it, many times operating these vehicles. Charging is a whole new world, in part because charging is a bit more nuanced. There's more ways that you can do it than our gasoline fueling. So our top row here, we have level 1 AC charging. So level 1 charging for an electric vehicle, oftentimes called a trickle charge, means you're plugged into a regular wall outlet, which all electric vehicles can do. They all come with a portable cable to be able to do so. Most vehicles will get a charge rate of about 4 or 5 miles of range per hour that they charge this way. It sounds really slow, but if you think about it, most of us have vehicles, they're probably parked somewhere either all night or all day while we're working, or both. If you're able to be plugged in during one or both of those times, you can be getting 30, 40, 50 miles from an overnight or an all-day charge. And for most of us, that's about how much we drive. So many people find this is actually sufficient to meet their driving needs, as long as they have a backup of a public station nearby for those times of higher usage. So this is a very common charging method for plug-in hybrids, as well as electric vehicles that are not driven high mileage. Next, we have level 2 AC charging. This is the most common method of charging for electric vehicles. And this is where we're plugging into essentially a 220 or 240 volt outlet. If you think in your home, that's the equivalent of like an electric dryer outlet. It's just going to be at a higher amperage than you would have for a dryer. So this would generally provide somewhere in the range of 10 to 25 miles per hour or higher. It depends on the amperage as well as the capabilities of the vehicle to receive the charge rate. Plug-in hybrids are generally not designed to receive as high of a charge rate because they just don't need to, whereas larger vehicles maybe like upcoming pickup truck models, they may be designed to be able to take a higher amperage so you can get more miles per hour. So this is a sufficient charge rate that if you're able to charge this way overnight or during the day, you're gonna have a full charge every day. And if you have a full charge every time you go out for a drive, that's going to meet about 97 to 98% of your driving needs on average. So you'll find that you don't need to charge elsewhere very often except for those long distance trips. Lastly, we have DC fast charging, which, as it sounds like, is the fastest way to charge. DC fast charging is generally, it's always going to be a public station that you would access. The most common places that we see these is along interstates, other long distance roadways where people are traveling a long ways and depleting that full battery, need a quick charge up to stay on the road. We also see it in denser communities or communities that have high rates of individuals that may not be able to charge at home, such as apartment buildings, high rises, things like that. It's a good way for them to be able to get that access to charging, especially with somewhere that they're already going on a recurring basis. We also have on here the plug types for these different types of charging. As you can see, there's really not that many different plug types. And for DC fast charging, there's 3 there, but that CHAdeMO plug is pretty well obsolescent. It's not utilized much anymore. So for the most part, every vehicle other than Tesla is going to use that J1772 plug for level 1 and 2 charging. It's going to use that CCS plug for DC fast charging. Tesla has its own plug type, so if it's a Tesla charging station, they're the only one that can use it. But Tesla has adapters to be able to use the other plugs, so they can also take advantage of the other public infrastructure. Next slide. So as we think about electric vehicles and charging, it really is a paradigm switch in how we view fueling our vehicles. Gasoline vehicles, you're going to a gas station. That's it. You have to find a gas station and that's where you fuel up. With electric vehicles, it's actually a pretty small percentage of total fueling that happens at something like a gas station, something like a DC fast charging station. It currently about 80 to 90% of charging happens at home or work. And that will likely stay the case moving forward. It may decrease a bit as more people that do not have access to home charging own electric vehicles. But it's always going to remain the case that a very large portion of charging happens at home or at work when we're out and about, and a relatively small percentage will happen at these high power charging stations along roadways similar to a gas station model. Yeah, next slide. And where are these stations and how many do we have at this point? So there's certainly increasing numbers of these stations all the time. In Pennsylvania, there's now over 2,800 publicly available plugs. You can see that they're distributed largely throughout the state, kind of following population density as well as the uptake of electric vehicles. All of the green dots are level 2 stations. The orange and red dots are the DC fast charging stations. There's some black dots there for the Tesla stations available to those vehicles. And you can see there's a variety of ways that you can find where these charging stations are. Websites, including the 511 PA website. And then there can also be, many times there's in-car support to help you find these stations, even plan your trip. Many vehicles now, if you punch in its in-vehicle navigation, how far you're going, it will automatically determine that, hey, that's beyond the current range that you have in the battery. These are the stations you could charge at along the way. So there's a lot of support to help you with that. Next slide. We're also seeing greatly increasing numbers of these vehicles in Pennsylvania. So this is registrations over the last couple of years for electric vehicles. Registration data only has full electric vehicle and then hybrid. So plug-in hybrids are likely included within that hybrid category. So if we just look at those all electric vehicles, looking across from left to right here, we can see that each year, there's definitely an increasing number of them. And just this year, I mean, it's, basically all that we gained from March of last year to March of this year happened again just in the next 4 months, 4 or 5 months. So it's definitely an increasing rate of electric vehicle adoption. Next slide. Pennsylvania, or PennDOT also has a resource that you can, there's a link to it at the bottom of the slide, as well as at the resources page at the end of this presentation. But it lets you see kind of where these vehicles are located in terms of their density. The white spaces does not mean that there are no electric vehicles there. It just means that it's the lower zip codes. About less than 50 vehicles per zip code is the white spaces. And then all of the zip codes that have more than that, varying degrees of color scale there. So you can see where these vehicles are concentrated throughout the state. Next slide. And here we have new vehicle sales data for electric vehicles. So you can see really taking off here just in the last year or two. We're now up to 2.5, 2.67-ish% of new vehicles sold in Pennsylvania were electric last year, either all electric or plug-in hybrid. Thus far, we have the first 5 months of data for 2022. Those first 5 months, we are already at about 8,000 new electric vehicles sold and about 4% market share. So continuing the upward trend, we're on track to definitely well exceed last year's numbers. Next slide. So with that introduction to electric vehicles, I'm now going to move into some of the things that DEP is doing to support their adoption. So this summarizes some of the main initiatives that we have here at DEP for electric vehicles. I'm going to cover a number of these in more detail on later slides. At the moment, I'm just going to cover the last couple bullets in more detail. So we're currently working on a study looking at the rate design, essentially the way that we pay for electricity that's used to charge electric vehicles. There's a number of reasons for this. One is that if as we transition to more electric vehicles and they start to have a greater share of our electricity consumption, if we continue our current charging patterns or we don't do anything and we allow a lot of charging to happen in the evening over the summer when we may already be experiencing pretty high strain on the grid due to summer, that could be a problem. That could pose some significant strain. But if through price signals, we get more charging to occur overnight when there is plenty of spare capacity on the grid, then it can actually put downward pressure on electricity prices because the electric grid is able to put more amount of electricity across and through it without increasing the overall grid infrastructure. So that's just one example. There's 3 or 4 main things that we're looking at with that study, but it's just as we get more of these electric vehicles on the road and consuming electricity, we definitely need to plan and prepare for those sorts of impacts. So that's an example of something that my office is working on right now. And of course, we also do a large variety of stakeholder and public education. So if you or any of your organizations that you work with would be interested in receiving something similar to what we're doing here today, definitely feel free to reach out. That is part of what we do. Next slide. So one of the first big things that DEP did for electric vehicles, or not first, but one of the big things that we've done is we helped with the development of the Pennsylvania Electric Vehicle Roadmap, which was released in 2019, included 13 recommended actions for increasing electric vehicle adoption in Pennsylvania. And it's really guided a lot of our efforts since then. There's also a 2021 update in booklet format to the EV roadmap. So it's a really great resource for anyone looking to an introduction of electric vehicles in Pennsylvania, as it's just 12 pages walking you through some of the major incentives, the introductions to vehicles and charging, things like that. We also, DEP and PennDOT jointly coordinate the Drive Electric Pennsylvania Coalition. So that largely consists of quarterly calls, quarterly meetings where we provide informational updates, speakers, presenters on just the latest that's happening with electric vehicle policy and initiatives at the state and federal level. Anyone that's interested is welcome to join those, and you can get on the email list by going to that website. Next slide. So there's a couple of primary funding programs that we have to support electric vehicles. As you can see from the image on the right, that is essentially the pie of Pennsylvania's share of the Volkswagen diesel settlement dollars. We're allowed to spend 15% of those funds on charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. That's the orange slice of that pie. We have used that for the level 2 rebate program and the DC fast charging and hydrogen fueling grant program. There, you can also use some of those other programs to help fund larger, like class 4 through 8 electric vehicle purchases. So that's also something to look into. But through the level 2 rebate program, which is basically available to any organization in Pennsylvania, you can use that to help install level 2 charging at a public space, at a workplace, or multi-unit dwelling. And thus far, it has helped with the installation of over 1,600 charging plugs throughout the state. Next slide. These are the current rebate amounts for that level 2 rebate program. So this is the maximum incentive that you could receive through the program. As you can see, it depends on if your project is going to be publicly available and networked. Networked meaning that it's essentially connected to cell data that has that constant connection to provide real-time updates, enables credit card transactions, things like that. And then there's also multi-unit dwelling projects and all other eligible, which is largely your workplace projects and your public projects that are not networked. You note the priority county item there and all other counties. Priority counties are largely our more rural counties, counties with a population less than 100,000 people, as well as counties that have not seen as many projects through the level 2 rebate program as compared to the statewide average. So you can see the full list in the program guidelines for this program. You can find them by going to the website URL at the bottom of the page here, and then going to the level 2 rebate program guidelines. Next slide. A couple more details about the level 2 rebate. So if it's something that you're looking to do a project for, just keep in mind, we do require that standard J1772 plug we talked about earlier, minimum of 7.2 kilowatt charging output, which has become pretty standard for most level 2 charging now, and at least 2 plugs in your project. This program is still, it basically stays open continuously, though we are getting towards the end of our available funding for the program, so it may run out sometime next calendar year. Next slide. Other important things to think about if you are contemplating a level 2 charging project. There's a number of things that go into planning out that project, such as where you're locating the equipment. That has an impact both on the user's experience with charging. It also has an impact on your installation cost. More trenching, more tearing up asphalt or concrete and having to redo them, and longer distances from the electrical supply of a nearby building. Those are all things that would increase cost. And obviously the vice versa would decrease the cost. You want to think about if you want the station to be networked. As you saw, it impacts your rebate amount, but also impacts the cost of your project, as networked equipment does cost more to purchase, as well as more to operate over time, as you're going to have something kind of like a cell phone plan, in the sense that there's going to be an annual fee to maintain that networking. But the flip side does provide you with access to a lot of data, real-time information about if there's any problems with the station, so it can be addressed right away, as well as I mentioned, the ability for real-time payments. And then think about if you want the station to be for public charging or not. Really think about what is the purpose of your charging project. And that should be what the focus is. And if it is available to the public, what would you charge as a fee? You don't have to charge anything. We don't have any rules on how you would set the fee, what units you may use, or the amount. But it's good things to think about in planning for your project. After you would receive a rebate, so as didn't specifically mention, you do need to apply for rebate before you would start doing the project on the property. So the right time to apply is when you have quotes for your project. And then you would apply, you receive a rebate that's valid for 180 days to give you time to install the equipment and submit for reimbursement. If the project would be delayed beyond those 180 days, you can reapply for a new rebate and restart that clock. Next slide. All right, so moving on from level 2. So as I mentioned, we've also run a DC fast charging and hydrogen fueling grant program. So thus far, that program has had 5 rounds of applications. We have not announced the awards yet from the last one, so we've announced 4 rounds of awards. Those have included 18 projects installing more than 50 DC fast charging plugs throughout the state. Of those 18 projects, 7 are now completed. Note that we do not anticipate having another application round for this program. PennDOT will talk more about the future opportunities for DC fast charging that will be coming from them. Next slide. Our last funding program that we offer from DEP that is very much applicable for electric vehicle projects is the Alternative Fuels Incentive Grant Program. This is for fleets looking to electrify or go to any type of alternative fuel, electric being included. So the program is competitive, so it is currently open for applications. It has 2 due dates. Essentially, those funds are split between the 2 due dates, 2 rounds of applications. So half the funds will go towards this first due date coming up very soon, and half will go to the December 16th due date. There's a couple different types of projects you can apply for. One is the incremental cost of purchasing an alternative fuel vehicle. So for class 3 and larger vehicles, there's both a cap as well as you have to show the incremental cost of that vehicle purchase. For class 1 and 2 vehicles, which is all of our vehicles under 10,000 pounds, if you're looking to buy an electric fleet vehicle, you can apply for just a fixed $7,500 per vehicle. So that can go a long way with helping offset the higher upfront purchase price of those vehicles to help you get started on electrifying a fleet. And on the right, we have the consumer rebate program. That is also a separate piece of the fund that goes into our alternative fuels program. So at the moment, that program is $750 for a new or used electric vehicle, $500 for a new or used plug-in hybrid. It'll run that way through the end of this month. Starting September 1st, this program will have an income cap. So it'll become a low and middle income rebate program. And with that income cap, we'll be able to increase the rebate amount so that we can best incentivize and provide that needed purchase offset for households and individuals that could really benefit from it to be able to take advantage of electrification. So you can see the full details of that. It's now on the website. Was recently posted there since I last updated this slide. So you can see all those revised rules that will be coming up starting September 1st. It's easy to find. You can either search for PA AFIG rebate, or you can search for Pennsylvania electric vehicle rebate. Both of those will bring it up from any internet search. And with that, I'll say next slide and turn it over to PennDOT.
Thank you, Colton. You can go to my next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that we have been doing here at PennDOT to prepare ourselves for electrification. And one of those is our EV mobility plan. This plan was just released publicly. It's available on our website a couple weeks ago. But when we were talking about ways to plan for electrification, we really wanted to start looking at the mobility and of those driving, not only here in the state, but through our state as well. So the mobility plan really took a look at 3 key components. It looked at key corridors that people travel to and through our state. It also looked at key destinations across the state things like our state parks, our recreational opportunities, but also things like colleges and universities, airports, and other places that people travel to during their normal daily activities. The third component of the mobility plan was really taking a look at our emergency and evacuation travel needs. So thinking about a winter storm or a flooding event or any other kind of natural disaster or man-made disaster that potentially there are people be evacuating, looking at those routes, not only from our state's perspective, but some of our neighboring states also use some of Pennsylvania roadways in their evacuation strategies. So looking at those and making sure that we are prepared for infrastructure to support those and what those needs might be. So the mobility plan really took a look at that. It started to say what our planning efforts should be to have really good mobility options for our state. Next slide. Another item that we thought was really important was looking at EV model ordinances. So earlier this year, we were able to do a project in collaboration with Temple University. Their capstone project this year worked at doing a best practice search across all 50 states to see where there really was good guidance for municipalities as they're doing their planning work related to electrification. And that team of students put together a model ordinance toolkit. It is available on our website, has a lot of good resources there that anyone is eligible to look at. And when you're planning for your local municipality, can take tools from that toolkit as you're doing your preparations for electrification. Next slide. So I'm going to spend a good portion of my time talking about the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. We refer to that as NEVI. Next slide. So a little bit of background on the formula program in case you're not familiar with it. It was funded through the bipartisan infrastructure law. Some people refer to it as the bill, some as the IIJA. So that is where the funding comes for this program. Pennsylvania is slated to receive $171.5 million of that funding from the NEVI program across 5 years for our electric vehicle infrastructure. The program will be administered by the DOT. The Volkswagen settlement money in most states was run through the DEP, as was the case here in Pennsylvania. So this program will be funded and run by PennDOT itself. All of the states must submit a NEVI state plan to the federal government for consideration. The plan really talks about how we are going to use our funds and how we're planning to use those funds across the 5 years. And that state plan due date was August 1st. We did submit our plan to the federal government on July 21st, a few days ahead of that deadline. We have not received permission to spend any of our funding yet. Once we get permission from the federal government, our plan is approved, we will then be eligible to spend the funding that is coming to our state. The plan is considered an evolving document. The first iteration of the report actually covers the first 2 federal fiscal years. So both federal fiscal year 22, which is the one we are in and ends here at the end of September, and then federal fiscal year 2023. So the first year's plan will use 2 years worth of funding, or is eligible to use up to 2 years worth of funding. Next slide. So the National Infrastructure Fund, the NEVI program, really has some qualifications in place. There's been a lot of guidance sent out from the federal government of what that infrastructure looks like, where it must be placed. So to start with, I have a couple slides that's going to explain this, but all of the funding initially from that, not just for Pennsylvania, but for all of the states, must go to their alternative fuel corridors. I'm going to explain that a little bit more on my next slide. But the infrastructure also must be a DC fast charge that Colton had talked about earlier. It's our fastest charging. It must be publicly accessible and not proprietary in nature. So currently, Tesla stations don't count towards that. There has been rumor from Tesla, or not rumor, but conversation from Tesla that they are working on having something that is eligible for all use cases. If and when that comes out, then their model would be eligible for this funding as well. All of the stations must have at least 4 ports with 150 kilowatts worth of power, 600 kilowatt total simultaneous charging availability, that CCS connector that Colton talked about, is the new standard for that, for those charging stations. And then all of the stations must be within 1 mile of the interstate and less than 50 miles distance to the next station on the alternative fuel corridors. And if you go to the next slide, I'm pretty sure it has my map up. Yeah, so the alternative fuel corridor program is one that the federal government had established back in 2016. And we, Pennsylvania, have participated in all 6 rounds of that. We currently have all of our interstates. It's kind of the darker blue lines that you see here on the map. All of our interstates, and then portions of US 30, US Route 1, 422, and 15 designated as alternative fuel corridors for electric vehicles. The alternative fuel corridor does also have for other alternative fuels, but today we're focusing just on our electric vehicle one. So we will be working to build out these corridors. That is the #1 priority of all the AFC funding, or the funding coming out will be on these AFCs. So you can see from this map, we also connect into alternative fuel corridors in our surrounding states. Both or all of the ones around us, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia, Ohio. We've had conversations with those states because the goal of the NEVI program is to have a consistent charging network across all 50 states. So no matter if you're charging within a state or across state borders, that you know that station availability is there and feel comfortable and have confidence in driving an electric vehicle. Next slide. I think I already started to talk about my next slide a little bit, but priorities for the NEVI funds, it really is to build out that alternative fuel corridor network. Once the states, Pennsylvania and all states, fully build out their network. So a full build out means that there's stations less than 50 miles apart on all of those corridors. Then we have the capability of spending our funding outside of the AFC network. And can use it in any publicly accessible space and on any other public roadway. So all the states are really working towards filling out those alternative fuel corridors so that they have flexibility in their build out and the use of their funds. Another goal for us is really to have some redundancy in the system. I know right now, at least in my hometown, there's a lot of times where there's more than one gas station off an exit, or even if you think of other models like a drugstore, a lot of times there's a Rite Aid and a CVS across the street from each other. So, you know, people really want to have choice in where they're charging. Maybe you're picking where you charge your station based on the coffee you like to drink each day. So having that redundancy in the system will also help as more cars come to market and more capacity might be needed. Next slide. So after the corridors are fully built out, we really started to take a look at what should we be looking at next. And some of the ways that we are prioritizing that is really been foundational from our mobility plan, but starting to look at other key interstates along our network, ways that we can support our disadvantaged communities, our emergency routes, and really thinking about ways that we can start addressing community needs for charging, especially as Colton had mentioned a little bit earlier, you know, not everyone has a place to park every night or the same place to park every night, like a garage. A lot of individuals have street parking or live in a multi-unit dwelling where maybe there's a parking lot, but not a dedicated space for you. So starting to look at those types of needs. We also are starting to do some of our planning work related around medium duty and heavy duty freight travel, as many of those vehicles are also starting to transition to electric vehicles, especially in the medium duty space right now. A lot of you'll see a lot of articles about like UPS and Amazon and a lot of the kind of delivery vans that are in and out of our neighborhoods starting to switch over to electrification or electric vehicles. Next slide. So as we were putting our plan together, we really wanted to make sure that we were starting to hear from individuals. We did in April and May, and I think the beginning of June, we had 13 specific stakeholder sessions. We also took all of that information and then had put our draft plan together. And once our plan was together, we went out with a survey. Now, the survey was tailored a little bit more towards our stakeholders. We had over 2,000 individuals who had been invited to those sessions. So we had sent our survey out to all of them, but we also listed it publicly on our website and some other means, through a press release, etc. And we got a lot of good feedback from that. Over 4,400 responses. This little heat map you see shows where those responses came from across the state. But when we looked at that, we read all of those comments. It did take a lot of time to go through them all. But there was some really good feedback that we received from that report, talking about some of our goals. While we know that we here in the United States have transportation as the #1 emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, we had always talked about the benefit of electrification on our climate goals, but we didn't really have a climate goal in our plan. So that was one of the things that came out from the survey. And then we have since added a climate related goal into our NEVI plan. That was one of the good feedback things that we had heard from our stakeholders. Another thing really was about this training needs for first responders, really making sure as we're rolling out our business approach and how we're going to solicit for proposals, that there's a lot of opportunity for individuals of different types of businesses to be involved in that. So a lot of good feedback came from that survey. Next slide. So the NEVI plan, again, here's a little bit more details on that. There was 14 key sections of the plan itself, as was prescribed by the federal government. Looking at kind of our overall visions and goals, which I've talked about a little bit, also has a lot of information on where we think EV charging infrastructure is needed and should be planned for over the next couple of years. It really starts to identify some gaps and opportunities for filling that infrastructure. And a big section of the report also talks about how we will be contracting once we receive the funding from, or eligibility for the funding, and also our labor and workforce needs. And I think I'm going to talk about that here a little bit on my next couple slides. Next slide. So labor and workforce, you know, Colton mentioned this earlier. It's one of the key benefits, I think, on the very first slide. But there is a lot of funding coming out, not just from the NEVI program, but from some other federal programs right now that support the workforce needs. And, you know, there's a lot of opportunities, not just for those installing, operating, and maintaining the EV infrastructure, but also when we think about other types of jobs related to that, a lot of goods type of engineering jobs related to that installation and maintenance, but also when we think about technicians that are inspecting our cars annually here in Pennsylvania, making sure that they are upskilled to look at electric vehicles as well as the gas combustion engines and the types of things they look at inspection process currently. We've also really been talking about first responder training in case of a fire for an electric vehicle or electric vehicle charging infrastructure, making sure that our first responders know how to interact with a car or a station in those instances. So making sure that we're having a lot of conversations around workforce and training. Next slide. With every new technology, you know, there's always different risks and challenges. I always like to think of them as opportunities for us to make good change. You can just see here on the slide some of the other things that we've been talking about as we put our plan together, really trying to understand national issues like supply chain and Buy America, looking at emergency response, accessibility, land use, where we put these and the ways that people interact with them, ways that we can support our disadvantaged and underserved populations with this infrastructure to have a cleaner environment as we install this. So just a lot of risks and challenges identified throughout our NEVI plan, and the ways that we hope to address them is in there as well. Next slide. So the program implementation, how are we actually going to spend this money, and how are we working to do that? So there's a lot of benefits for a business to have infrastructure at their location. And we have put together this one pager that we've been sharing with businesses, kind of talks about funding opportunities, some of the ones that Colton mentioned, obviously the NEVI formula funds coming out, but it allows us to know that someone's interested in having a EV charging at their site, and then can connect them with key partners as they think about that opportunity. So for us, the procurement process that we're working on has not been finalized. We have a team that works on that and has been meeting weekly as we work towards putting together that process. We will be very transparent in how we are evaluating proposals as they come in. And we will be hopefully having that process up and running here this fall when we have received approval from the federal government to move forward with our NEVI plan. Next slide. We are also working on a full public engagement strategy. This is required by the federal government, and we are working with many stakeholders as we put together these sessions. Across the fall, we will be traveling and doing some in-person engagement across the state. Plenty of opportunities for different businesses, chambers, and our utilities to be involved in that as well. Next slide. All right, so federal funding opportunities. Colton's going to do the first slide, and then I have two. I know we're getting close on time, and we want to have a chance for questions, so we're going to run through these quickly. Next slide. Colton, you're on mute.
Got the video, not the mute. All right. In quick summary here, there is a federal tax credit at the moment for purchasing a new electric vehicle. There's some uncertainty there. So with the Inflation Reduction Act, as we know, like we just got the final legislative text of that, and it's not yet officially passed into law. Just keep in mind, if you are looking to purchase an electric vehicle in the very near future, it's possible that the signing of that legislation will actually eliminate the current income tax credit for the remainder of this calendar year before the new tax credit starts taking effect next calendar year. I just learned about that recently, so it's just a big heads up to everyone. But in any case, there are 4 major provisions for electric vehicle tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. They all have their details to learn about, but the main takeaway here is that there is definitely going to be some expanded opportunities for tax credits and really incentivizing electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. It will be a little bit till we have, detailed guidance from the IRS and others on how it will be implemented. But we'll certainly be able to provide more detail in the near future as we learn it.
Next slide. Another program we wanted to talk about is an EPA-funded program called the Clean School Bus Program. And this program is really to replace existing school buses with low and zero emission school buses to really help improve air quality across all of our communities here in Pennsylvania and across the country. This application deadline for the first round is unfortunately this week, August 19th. We've just been trying to continue to share opportunities related to this program because it is a lot of money eligible to replace buses and school bus. EV school buses are a lot more expensive than a regular traditional school bus. So a great way for our communities to benefit from having these new and cleaner school buses. So if any of your local communities are interested, there is a link to that on this site, and we do have some resources through our Clean Cities partners if people need help with application support. Next slide. And the last one I want to talk about here, and this is going to be a really important one for all of you moving forward. Later this fall, the federal government is expected to come out with their discretionary grant program for electric vehicles. It also is for other alternative fuel types. But this program is one that our local communities are eligible to apply for. The local governments, our MPOs and RPOs, also our transit and port authorities. But these will be ones that really are going to go to support our community needs, our neighborhoods that don't have their own private parking spaces. So when this one comes out, it's definitely something that we will be sharing and making sure that everyone knows of this opportunity so that we, Pennsylvania, can be successful in our grant programs, our grant applications for this program. So I think that's our last of our slides. We will open it up to questions. I saw some coming in through the chat, but we will be sharing this presentation afterwards, and we do have some good resources listed on one of our last slides here too as well. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. We do have a good bit of questions, so I'll get right into it. I've been writing them down, and I'll ask. The first question is actually from me. I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of where we're at in Northeast PA in meeting those requirements for the alternative fuels corridor. I mean, do we have these charging stations in Northeast PA every 50 miles, or are we way
So if
far
you
from
can,
getting to that.
I don't know if you can go to slide 8, the interactive map slide. I don't know if you can go back quick. So on this map, while she's pulling it up, this is actually on our website, but the map on this page, sorry, if you look at the darker red circles that kind of have the plus symbol in them, those are the ones that are actually NEVI compliant at this time. So because the federal government had changed the criteria used to be within 5 miles of an interstate, and now it's down to within 1 mile of an interstate. So a lot of the stations that we had on our alternative fuel corridors really dropped off from being compliant due to that mileage distance change. So right now we only have 9 stations. It looks like more on this map, but I think there's only 9 or 11 stations across the whole entire state that are NEVI compliant. So a lot of room for growth. Any station that potentially maybe was within a mile, but only had 2 plugs instead of the 4 plugs, those kind of things, those are eligible to apply for upgrades to build out that infrastructure, but a great chance or a great opportunity to add additional infrastructure along these corridors.
Yeah, and I'll just add, so there is an Electrify America station in Scranton, so that's a really high power DC fast charging station. My office has awarded 2 DC fast charging projects in the northeast part of the state. I think one's on I-80 and one's on 84. Those are in process, so they're not done yet. We did those projects before, we knew the NEVI standard, so they're not at that same level of power, but they will still be DC fast charging stations.
Thank you. We had the first question that came in. Was there any initiatives that you know of to standardize the EV plug types?
I can take, yeah, it's a,
Okay.
so they're largely standardized. So as I mentioned, like, especially on level 1, level 2, basically everything uses J1772. Tesla has, its own plug, but there's a very cheap adapter that all Teslas come with that enables them to use the J1772. So that's very much standardized. DC fast charging is a little bit less so. Everyone other than Tesla uses the CCS plug. Tesla can use their own plugs, and Tesla can also use the CHAdeMO with an adapter. Tesla could release an adapter for the CCS plug anytime they want. They've already done so in Europe, just not for the American version of CCS. So really, as soon as Tesla releases that adapter, then everyone will be able to use CCS and we'll have full standardization.
Thank you. There was a question about kind of the integrity of charging stations, that maybe they're not, the capacity or the output isn't what's advertised. Is there some agency or some program that monitors that and keeps up with that?
So I will say the NEVI guidance at any of the stations using the NEVI funds, there is a lot of requirements around those stations, uptime requirements, et cetera, that those using those funds will have to follow. There is also operation and maintenance eligibility for funding to make sure that stations are performing the way they should be. A lot of data requirements using NEVI funds as well that the charging companies will have to provide, talking about number of times that the station is used, the uptime, the different components of that. A lot of data requirements related to that. But I know that is something I hear right now from charging stations, that sometimes they're not working or not all the plugs are working. But anything using NEVI funds will be pretty scrutinized related to that. I don't know if Colton wants to add anything.
Yeah, and there's a lot of contributing factors to poor performance of charging stations. One is that a lot of times those charging stations are owned by that whoever owns that property, and charging may not be their primary business, fueling may not be their primary business. So it may just not be a priority for them. Sometimes in the last year or two, it's been supply chain. It's been, they know that it's not working, they need a part, but they can't get the part for a couple months. There's a variety of explanations there. I know there's also, like on gas stations, there's a division of meets and measures that kind of oversees them, make sure they're performing the way that they're supposed to. I believe there's talk of having a similar meets and measures oversight for charging stations. I don't know any more details than that. I don't know if you know more on that part, Natasha.
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, there's talk of having more oversight and standardization for their output and oversight.
A question came in from Justin, and I'm wondering if he can unmute and ask it just to make sure that it's being asked in the way that he intended.
Absolutely. So I asked that question when we were talking about exactly that slide there. So for the network for these units, do you know if it's possible to connect them wirelessly, or do they need to run a data cable for that?
Yeah, so they're almost always wirelessly networked. And in fact, like that's good because it makes it easier. As long as there's available essentially cell service nearby, they can be wirelessly networked. The downside is that it creates essentially a cell phone plan that adds to the operational cost of the charging station. For a DC fast charging station, it's a small portion of your cost. But for level 2, it can really be difficult to break even on operating a station due to those costs. So there's actually new and increasing interest in having either LAN cables or Wi-Fi connections for the stations to really cut down on that networking cost. I've started really just starting to see that in the last few months here.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
Tom asked if PennDOT is considering the loss of the gas tax revenue and how impactful that might be.
So that's a great question. We here at PennDOT really rely on the motor fuel taxes to fund our department. And in fact, 75% of our state funding does come from fuel tax. So as vehicles become more fuel efficient and as they transition to electrification or other alternative fuels, it is really a loss to our revenue stream. We have been working with the legislature. There's a lot of proposals that have come out over the last year on different fees for electric vehicles. We really are just trying to be supportive of the legislature and looking at different options. And what will be passed by our state legislature is still yet to be determined. But we do think it's important for electric vehicles to be paying for their use of the roadway.
Any more questions? There's no more in the chat. We probably have time for one or two more. Anyone?
This is Don Bruminsky. Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
You don't see a lot of comparisons between cost driving gasoline versus electric. So in other words, for 100 miles, how many cents per kilowatt hours is equivalent to $4 per gallon gas, or some kind of equivalent? Do you have any discussion on operating costs?
Yeah, so a rough comparison there is to power an electric vehicle, you're going to pay somewhere in the order of the equivalent of $1.25 to $1.50 per gallon of gasoline.
Thank you.
Sure. And that's following the current average residential electricity price in Pennsylvania. So obviously, if you're at a charging station where a public charging station where it costs more, it'll be a bit higher than that. But if you're charging at home on a standard residential rate, that's your approximate.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm going to wrap up now because I know our presenters have back-to-back meetings this morning and need to probably jump on to the next one. So thank you everyone for joining us. Again, the partner chambers on this program, so thankful to have everyone come together and to hear from Colton and Natasha today. This presentation has been recorded and it's available. If you have some coworkers who you think could benefit from seeing it, encourage them to check it out. But appreciate everyone today. Thank you, and have a great, safe day.